My name is Sam. I love reading and I love English. Many people ask me, Sam, why do you always read? Why do you say reading is so important? I smile and say, because reading changed my life. When I started my channel Bookish English, my goal was simple. I wanted to help people see that reading is not boring. Reading is not hard. Reading is the key to learning anything fast. I know some of you think, I already go to English class. I do my homework. I listen to podcasts. I watch YouTube videos. Why do I need to read? My friend, reading is different. When you read, your brain works in a special way. You see new words. You feel the rhythm of sentences. You learn grammar without trying. Reading helps you think in English. Reading makes your brain strong. It helps you understand faster, speak better, and write more clearly. I did not always love reading. When I was young, I thought reading was a school thing. It was something I had to do, not something I wanted to do. I only read textbooks. They were full of rules, questions, and boring exercises. I never read for fun. But one day, my teacher gave me a small storybook. She said, Sam, you don't need to answer any questions. Just read this for yourself. The story was simple. It was about a boy and his dream. I read one page, then another. I did not stop. For the first time, I enjoyed reading. I was not studying. I was living inside the story. After that, I wanted more books. I wanted to read every day. That's when I understood something big. Reading is not only for passing tests. Reading is for growing your mind. Every book is like a new world. When you read, you travel without moving. You see other people's lives. You understand their thoughts, their feelings, and their dreams. And when you understand them, you also understand yourself better. That is the magic of reading. It gives you more than words. It gives you wisdom. One day, one of my students said, Sam, I cannot read in English. It's too hard. I don't understand everything. I stop after 2 pages, I told him. You don't need to understand everything. You just need to understand enough to enjoy it. I said, choose easy stories. Choose something fun. Don't use a dictionary. Just follow the story. Guess the meaning. Feel the language. He tried it. After 1 month, he came to me smiling. He said, Sam, I can read now. I don't feel afraid. I enjoy it. That was the moment I felt proud, because reading works like magic when you do it the right way. In my channel, Bookish English, I always tell people, don't read for grammar. Don't read for exams. Read because you love stories. When you love stories, learning happens by itself. Many people think reading is old-fashioned. They think reading is slow. But the truth is, reading is the fastest way to learn deeply. When you read, you are not only learning English, you are also training your brain to focus. You are learning patience. You are learning imagination. You are learning to see the world with new eyes. I remember one evening when I was reading an English story called The Secret Garden. The language was simple, but the message was deep. It was about kindness, hope, and nature. I finished it in 2 days. After that, I felt something inside me. I felt peaceful. I felt strong. I understood that reading gives energy to the heart. When you read, you don't just improve your English, you also improve your soul. My students often ask, "But Sam, what should I read?" I always say, anything you like. Read fairy tales, read comics, read short stories, read simple novels, read what makes you happy. You don't need to read difficult books. If a book is too hard, close it and pick another one. There is no rule that says you must finish every book. Easy reading is the best reading, because when you read easily, you don't feel stress. You learn without effort. You grow without pain. And the more you read, the more you understand. Slowly, you will see that you don't need the dictionary anymore. You will start to think in English. You will start to dream in English. I know this because it happened to me. When I started reading English books, I had to use the dictionary every few lines. It was slow, it was tiring, but I didn't stop. I told myself, I will just enjoy the story. I started with short stories, then I moved to longer ones. After 1 year, I could read novels without help. I was shocked. I could feel the meaning of the sentences. I could understand jokes, feelings, and culture. It was like magic. Reading had changed my English completely. My grammar became natural. My vocabulary became rich. My speaking became faster, and my writing became clear. All because I read. I did not do grammar drills. I did not memorize word lists. I just read stories that I loved. One of my favorite books was Charlotte's Web. It was about friendship and kindness. The words were simple, but I cried at the end. That book taught me more about life than any textbook. That is why I tell all my students, read what you love. Read every day, even if it's just one page. Reading is not about speed. It's about connection. Every time you read, you connect with new ideas, new people, and new worlds. You grow quietly, word by word, and one day you will realize that your English is not the same anymore. You will understand movies better. You will speak with more confidence. You will write with more heart. Reading gives you this power. Some people say, "But Sam, I have no time to read." I tell them, you don't need hours. You just need 10 minutes a day. 10 minutes is enough to start. You can read while drinking tea. You can read before bed. You can read on the bus. The important thing is to make reading a habit. A little every day becomes a lot in 1 year. If you read 10 pages a day, in 1 year, you will finish more than 10 books. And if you read 10 books, your English will never be the same again. So today, my dear friend, I want to tell you something simple. If you really want to learn English, you must read. Not because your teacher said so, not because it's homework, but because reading is the key that opens every door. It helps you think better, speak better, and live better. It's the secret that all good learners know. So start small, start easy, but start today. This is the first step to your new life with English. When I started to read more and more, I began to notice many small changes in my life. My English was not only better, my mind was also more calm. Reading became like a friend to me. It was always there when I needed it. If I felt sad, I read. If I felt tired, I read. If I felt happy, I also read. Every book gave me something new, Some books made me laugh, some made me cry, some made me think deeply about life. That is why I say reading is not just an English skill, it is a life skill. It helps you understand people, emotions, and the world around you. One day, a student from my channel, Bookish English, sent me a message. He said, "Sam, I started reading because of your videos. At first it was hard. I didn't understand everything. But now I can finish a small book in 1 week. I feel proud." When I read his message, I smiled, because that is what reading does. It makes you proud of yourself. You see your progress. You feel stronger. Every finished book is like a small victory. You start to trust yourself. You start to believe that you can do anything. That feeling is beautiful. I always tell my students that reading is not a race. You don't need to read fast. You just need to read with your heart. Take your time. Enjoy every page. Every page is a small step forward. Every story teaches you something new. Even easy stories have deep lessons. I remember when I read a short English story called The Happy Prince. The words were very easy, but the story touched my heart. It was about kindness, love, and giving. It made me think about what it means to be a good person. That is what good reading does. It makes you feel something real inside. Sometimes people tell me, "Sam, I read, but I forget the words later." I say, "It's okay. You don't need to remember everything." When you read, the words go inside your mind. Maybe you don't remember them today, but your brain remembers them quietly. One day, when you speak or write, the words will come out naturally. Reading is like planting seeds in your brain. You don't see the plant grow every day, but one day it becomes a big tree. Every page you read is one more seed. That is why you must keep reading, because reading never wastes your time. It builds your future. I also tell my students that reading helps you think in English. When you read a lot, you don't translate anymore. You don't think in your language. You start to feel the language. You understand it in your heart. That is the biggest change. You start to speak faster. You start to write more easily. You start to understand jokes and stories without trying too hard. That is when you know your English is becoming natural. Reading gives you that gift. I know many people say, "But Sam, I like to watch movies." Isn't that enough? I tell them, movies are good. They help your listening. But reading gives you power that movies cannot. When you watch a movie, the story moves fast. You don't stop to think about every word. But when you read, you control the speed. You can stop, think, and feel the words. You can go back. You can take time. You can see how the writer builds the sentences. You can notice how words work together. You start to see patterns. That is how you really learn a language. Step by step, word by word. I remember when I was reading The Little Prince. It was not only a story for children. It was full of life lessons. I underlined many sentences. One of them said, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly." I read that line many times. It made me quiet for a long moment. That is what reading does. It makes you stop and think. It connects your heart and your mind. That is how you grow. not just as a learner, but as a person. One day I asked my followers on Bookish English what kind of stories they liked. Many said they liked simple stories with meaning. So I told them, then read short stories or fairy tales. Don't worry if they sound childish. Even simple stories can teach deep things. I told them about a study where students who read easy books learned faster than students who only studied grammar. Because when you read easy books, you learn naturally. Your brain relaxes. You enjoy. You forget that you are learning. And that is when real learning happens. You don't force it. You just live it. I saw this with many students. Some studied grammar every day, but they still spoke slowly. Others read every day, and they spoke naturally. Reading gives you confidence. You start to see how words live together. You see grammar in action, not just in rules. You start to feel what sounds right and what doesn't. That is how native speakers learn, through reading and listening, not through rules. So if you want to sound natural, you must read. You must make reading your daily friend. I often say, a day without reading is like a day without sunlight, because reading brightens your mind. It gives you ideas. It gives you hope. It gives you peace. You don't need to be rich to read. You don't need to travel to learn. You only need one book. That book can take you to 1,000 places. I remember reading about a fisherman in one story, and I could almost feel the sea wind. I could smell the salt. I could hear the waves. That is the power of words. You travel with your mind. You live many lives in one life. That is something only reading can give you. Sometimes I meet people who say, Sam, I can't find a good book. I tell them, you must find the book that finds you. I believe that every person has one book that opens the door to reading. For some, it's a love story. For others, it's a mystery or an adventure. Once you find that one special book, you will never stop reading. You will want more. You will start to love the feeling of turning pages. You will feel proud that you understand English stories. You will feel happy that you can finish books. That happiness will push you to read more and more. And that is how you grow. Every page builds your future. Every story shapes your mind. That is why I say reading is not only about language, it's about life. Part 3. The book becomes a friend. Soon I started to see something new. The book was not only a tool for learning, it started to feel like a friend. When I felt sad, I opened it. When I felt alone, I read it. It did not shout. It did not judge. It was always calm. The words waited for me. The story spoke to me. Sometimes I smiled at a funny line. Sometimes I cried at a sad one. But every time, I felt lighter inside. The book became a small world I could enter anytime. It was safe. It was kind. And I started to understand that reading is not only for the mind, it is also for the heart. When I read, I met many people inside stories. Some were brave, some were afraid, some made mistakes, some changed their lives, and I learned from them. They became my silent teachers. They told me things without talking. I began to see myself in them. I thought, I am like this person, or I want to be strong like her. It felt like magic, meeting hundreds of people without leaving my room. One night I was tired after school. My eyes wanted to close, but I still wanted to read. I opened a small story about a boy who lived in a village. He wanted to go to a big city. He worked hard, saved money, and never gave up. At the end, he reached his dream. When I finished the story, I closed the book and whispered, "I can do that too." That small sentence stayed in my heart. It became a little light that never went out. After that, reading was not only a habit, it was something I loved. I didn't need anyone to tell me to read. I wanted to. I waited for it. I carried a book everywhere, on the bus, in the park, even in the kitchen. Sometimes people asked, "Why do you read so much?" I just smiled. How could I explain that books made me feel alive, that every page opened a new window in my mind, that every story gave me a reason to believe more in myself? Slowly, my English started to change too. I didn't even notice at first. But one day, when I talked to my teacher, she said, "You speak more clearly now." I was surprised. I didn't use grammar rules. I didn't memorize words. I only read every day. Reading had done something quietly. It built my English from the inside. It made my sentences longer. My thoughts became smoother. And I didn't translate anymore. I started to think in English. That was a special feeling. The book was still the same one I began with. It was old now. The pages were soft. The cover had small marks. But I loved those marks. They showed the time we spent together. I kept it near my bed. Every night before sleeping, I opened it. Sometimes I only read one page. Sometimes I read 10. But no matter how much I read, I always learned something. It could be a new word, a new idea, or a new feeling. Books never stop teaching if your heart is open. Once, my friend asked me, "How do you stay so calm?" "You never seem angry," I laughed and said, "Maybe because I read." It was true. Reading made my mind quiet. When I read, I forgot my problems. I forgot my phone. I forgot everything that made me worried. It was like taking a deep breath after a long day. Every sentence felt like peace. Some people listen to music to relax. I read. The words were my music. The stories were my songs. One day, it started to rain heavily. The sound of rain on the window mixed with the sound of turning pages. I remember that moment clearly. It was simple, but beautiful. I realized that happiness doesn't always come from big things. It can come from a soft chair, a warm blanket, and a good book. That moment taught me something important. Peace is not far away. Sometimes it's waiting inside the next page. After that, I began to share this love with others. I told my friends, "You should try reading too." Some said they didn't have time. Some said it was boring. But I gave them one small book and said, "Just read one page." A few days later, they came back smiling. One of them said, "Hey, that story was really nice." I smiled back. I knew that feeling. It was the first spark. Reading starts small, but once it touches your heart, it never leaves. Reading also helped me see the world differently. Before, I thought life was just about my school, my house, my town. But books took me to other countries. I learned about people from Japan, Africa, Europe, and everywhere. I saw how they lived, what they dreamed, and what they feared. I understood that even if we speak different languages, we all feel the same inside. We all laugh, cry, hope, and love. Reading made me more human. It made me kinder. Sometimes I think about my first day with that book. I didn't know it would change so much. I only wanted to learn a few words, but it gave me more than words. It gave me wisdom. It showed me that small actions, like opening a book, can lead to big changes in life. That is why I believe every book has a little bit of magic. You don't always see it, but you feel it when it starts to work inside you. That is how my journey with reading became a part of my life. It started with curiosity, then it became a habit, and now it's like breathing. I can't imagine my days without it. When I don't read, something feels missing, but when I do, I feel complete again. Reading connects me to something bigger, a world of words, ideas, and feelings that never end. After I realized how reading changed my life, I wanted to understand more. I wanted to know why reading works so well, so I started to learn about studies and experiments. I read about children in America who did not like school. Some had done small crimes, some were very shy, and some were bored all the time. Teachers gave some of these children free books. They did not tell them to read. They did not give homework. They did not punish them if they did not read. They could throw the books away if they wanted. But most children read the books. They read every day. Some read a book every 2 or 3 days. After a year, the teachers tested the children. The children who read books improved in reading and writing. They also liked school more. The children who did not get books stayed the same. Some even got worse. That experiment showed something simple. When people read because they want to, they learn much faster. Not only in English, but in life too. That is why reading for pleasure is so important. I told my students, you must choose books you love. Don't read boring books just because you think you should. When you love a book, your brain works better. You remember words without trying. You notice grammar without studying it. Reading becomes natural. I also learned about another experiment with students learning English in the Fiji Islands. The teachers tried 3 ways. One was normal grammar classes. One was reading in silence every day. One was the teacher reading stories aloud to the class. After a year, the students who read, in silence or with the teacher, did much better than the students who only did grammar. They learned faster. They understood more. They spoke more easily. That showed me that reading is not only fun, it is powerful. And it works for beginners and advanced learners. Many students think, I cannot read because it is too hard. I don't know the words. I get tired. I understand that feeling. I felt it too when I started. But I learned a trick. Start easy. Start with very simple books. Don't worry if you know only some words. If you understand about 95 to 98% of the story, that is enough. You don't need to stop for every word. Just follow the meaning. Enjoy the story. That is how your brain learns the rest. You learn naturally, without studying lists of words or rules. I remember when I read The Little Prince in English. I did not know all the words. Some sentences were hard, but I read every day. Slowly, I started to understand more. After a few weeks, I could read the whole story without help. That gave me confidence. That is why I tell my students, it is okay if you don't understand everything. It is okay if the first pages are slow. Keep going. Your brain will catch up. Reading also helps your imagination. When you read, you see pictures in your mind. You feel the characters' emotions. You hear the sounds and smell the smells. Your mind becomes alive. I remember reading a story about a forest. I could hear the birds. I could feel the wind. I could see the sunlight between the trees. I did not need to be there. The words created it in my mind. That is a special gift that reading gives. Not movies, not videos, only books. And when you read in English, your mind starts to think in English too. That is very important. At first, you may translate in your head, but after reading many stories, you start to understand without translation. Your brain learns the patterns of English. You learn how sentences are made. You learn how words work together. And slowly, speaking and writing become easier. You don't have to memorize grammar rules. You just feel the language. That is why I say reading is faster than studying grammar. Reading teaches naturally. I also learned that reading builds patience. When you read, you cannot rush. You cannot skip words. You follow the story page by page. At first, it feels slow, but after time, you notice something beautiful. You can focus longer. Your mind does not wander as much. You can read for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or more without stopping. That focus helps in school, in work, and in life. Reading makes you stronger mentally. It teaches you to be patient and enjoy the small moments. One of my students said, "Sam, I tried reading. I could only read 2 pages. Then I felt tired. I smiled and said, 'That is okay. 2 pages today, 3 pages tomorrow, 5 pages next week, small steps. Keep reading every day.'" That student came back after a month. He could read 10 pages in one sitting. He said, "Sam, I feel different. I feel calm. I feel happy." That is the power of small steps. Reading is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. I also tell my students about the types of books they can read. Start with short stories, fairy tales, comics, or even magazines. Choose books you like. Don't worry if they seem too simple. Simple books are the best for beginners. They make learning natural and fun. And when you finish one, you feel proud. That pride is a motivation to read more. It is better than any exam score. One of my students read only 1 book in 2 months, but she finished it. She felt proud, she smiled, then she picked another, and another. Slowly, she became a reader, and her English improved. That is how it always works. Reading makes learning fun. Reading makes learning easy. Reading gives results naturally. You don't have to force your brain, you just need to enjoy the story. I also want to tell you about a story I read for the first time in English. It was about a little boy who wanted to be brave. He was afraid of many things, but he kept trying. By the end, he was proud of himself. I read that story many times. Each time, I felt different. I felt stronger. I learned that books can teach life lessons too, not just language. Every story gives you knowledge about the world, about people, and about yourself. That is why I say reading is more than English. Reading is life. When you read, you meet hundreds of people, hundreds of situations, hundreds of feelings. And all of that builds your mind. Slowly, you become smarter, kinder, and stronger. That is why every learner must read. Not just for tests, not just for homework, but for life. That is what I want my students on Bookish English to understand. Reading is not hard. Reading is not boring. Reading is the easiest, most fun, and most powerful way to learn English. As I continued my reading journey, I noticed another amazing thing. Reading not only improved my English, it also made me more confident in life. When I met new people, I could talk about stories I read. I could tell them about characters, places, and adventures. People listened. They smiled. They asked questions. And I felt proud. I realized that books give you not only knowledge, but also courage. You have something to share with the world. That is why I always tell my students on Bookish English, when you read, you are never alone. You always have something to talk about, something to think about, something to imagine. Sometimes I even bring books to school or to meet friends. When I open a book in public, people notice. Some ask, "What are you reading?" That starts a conversation. Reading can create friends. It can create connections. That is something many people do not know. Books are not just private worlds. They can connect you with others. One day, I read a story about a girl who wanted to be a teacher. She loved helping children. She studied hard. She made mistakes. She failed sometimes, but she never gave up. I thought about myself and my students. I realized that reading teaches patience too. Patience with yourself and patience with others. You learn that mistakes are not bad. They are part of learning. You learn to try again. And that is a very important lesson, not just for English, but for life. I also noticed that reading helps memory. When you read stories, you remember characters, events, and words. Your brain practices remembering without pressure. You do not study like in a test. You remember naturally. Later, when you write or speak, the words come back easily. That is why reading is so much better than only memorizing vocabulary lists. One of my students said, "Sam, I read every day, but I forget new words quickly." I told him, "Keep reading. Don't worry. Your brain is storing the words quietly. One day, they will appear naturally when you speak or write." That is how language works. It is slow at first, but if you are consistent, the results are amazing. Reading also improves your imagination. I read many stories about adventures, faraway lands, and magical creatures. Even if I never visited those places, I could see them clearly in my mind. I could feel the wind, the sunlight, and the smells. That is something videos cannot give. Reading lets you create your own images. You control the story in your mind. That helps creativity too. I noticed this in my own life. When I tried to write my own short stories, ideas came easily. I could describe characters and places because I practiced with books. That is why reading is not just learning English. It is learning to think. Reading teaches you how to organize ideas, how to understand feelings, and how to imagine new things. Another important thing I learned is that reading builds focus. In today's world, many people are distracted. Phones, social media, and videos make it hard to concentrate. But when you read a book, you focus on the story. You follow the characters. You feel their emotions. That is real concentration. Over time, I noticed that my focus in school and in other activities became stronger. I could pay attention longer. I could finish tasks without stopping. That is another gift that reading gives. I remember a student telling me, "Sam, I can't read long texts." I get tired, I said. Start small. Read 1 page, then 2, then 3. Every day, your brain will get used to focusing. Soon you can read a whole story without stopping. That student started reading every day. After 1 month, she read a story of 10 pages easily. She said, "I feel proud. I can do it." That is how reading grows confidence, patience, focus, and happiness. I also want to tell you about a story I read in Spanish. I had learned English first, and then I tried Spanish. At first, it was very hard. I did not understand much, but I remembered my reading habits. I started with very easy books. Then I read books I already knew in English. That helped a lot. Slowly, I could understand new words. I read many stories. After 1 year, my Spanish improved a lot. I could talk to native speakers. I could understand podcasts, all because I read. That experience taught me that reading works in every language. It is not just for English, it is a universal tool. That is why I tell my students, reading is the fastest way to learn any language. You don't need long grammar lessons or complicated methods. You only need to read. Another thing I discovered is that reading makes you happy. It sounds simple, but it is true. When I read a story I like, I feel joy. I smile. I laugh. Sometimes I cry, but it is a good cry. It is a heart cry. Reading touches your feelings. It gives emotions. It makes life richer. That is why reading is not only learning, it is living. One night I read a story about a boy who found a lost dog. He took care of it, fed it, and loved it. The boy felt happy, and I felt happy too. That is the magic of reading. You live the life of the characters. You feel what they feel. That is something no video or game can give you. It is pure magic. I also tell my students, you don't need to read difficult books. Easy stories are better. If the book is too hard, it is not fun. Put it down. Find another. If the book is boring, stop. Find one that excites you. Reading should be fun. Reading should make you happy. One of my students followed my advice. She chose a small fairy tale book. She read it every day. She finished it in 1 week. Then she picked a longer story, then another. Slowly, she became a reader, and her English improved naturally. That is why I always say, reading for pleasure is the most powerful way to learn English. It builds vocabulary, grammar, imagination, focus, confidence, and happiness. It changes your life, slowly but surely. I want everyone on Bookish English to feel this power. That is why I tell my students, read a little every day. Read easy books. Read stories you love. Don't worry about mistakes or unknown words. Just enjoy. The rest will come naturally. Reading is simple. Reading is powerful. Reading is magical. That is why you must read. As my reading habit grew stronger, I realized that books are like doors. Each book opens a door to a new world. Sometimes it is a world you know, sometimes a world you have never seen, and each world teaches something new. One day, I read a story about a boy who wanted to learn music. He had no teacher, no piano, no friends who could help him. But he read about music, practiced every day, and never gave up. In the end, he could play beautiful songs. I thought about myself learning English. Reading works the same way. You start small, but if you keep practicing, you improve naturally. You don't need magic. You only need patience, time, and love for the story. Reading also teaches empathy. When you read about people in different situations, you feel what they feel. You understand their choices, their fears, their happiness. I read a story about a girl who lived in a poor village. She worked hard every day, yet she smiled. She loved her family even when life was hard. Reading that story made me think about my life. I felt grateful. I felt lucky. I felt inspired. That is the power of books. They show you life from another perspective. They teach you to feel, to care, to understand. When I shared these stories with my students on Bookish English, they smiled. Some said, "I never thought a story could teach me about life." I said, "Yes, it can." That is why reading is not just learning English. It is learning about yourself and the world. Another wonderful thing about reading is that it creates imagination in your everyday life. When you finish a story, sometimes you continue imagining it. You think, what happens next? Or, what if the character did something else? Your mind practices creativity. That is why I tell my students, reading is like a workout for your brain. You exercise memory, imagination, focus, and thinking skills. I also noticed that reading builds habits. When you read every day, you create a rhythm. You wake up and read. You go to school and read. You take a break and read. Slowly, reading becomes part of your life. It is not a chore anymore. It is a choice you love. One of my students, who hated studying English at first, told me, "Sam, I read every day now. It feels good. I don't want to stop." That is the moment I realized I had succeeded. Reading had become a natural habit for her. Another student shared a different story. He loved sports, but did not like reading. I gave him a short story about a young athlete who trained every day, failed many times, but finally won a race. He read one page, then two, then the whole story. After a week, he said, "Sam, I feel happy. I read a whole story." That small step changed his attitude toward reading. He became curious about other stories too. That is the power of easy and fun books. Small steps create big change. Reading also teaches problem solving. Stories often have challenges. Characters must find solutions. When you read, you think about the problem. You imagine solutions. You guess what will happen next. That trains your brain to think critically. I noticed this in my own life. When I faced a difficult situation, I remembered a story I read. I thought, what would the character do? And sometimes I found a solution for myself. That is why reading is more than words. Reading trains your mind to handle life. I also discovered that reading brings joy in small moments. You can read on a bus, in a park, before sleep, or even while waiting in line. You don't need a teacher. You don't need a classroom. You don't need a test. You just open a book and enter another world. That is freedom. That is happiness. I often tell my students, you can carry happiness in your bag. A small book, a few pages, and your day becomes brighter. Reading also creates patience and persistence. Sometimes a story is long. Sometimes the words are difficult. But if you continue, slowly, you reach the end. That feeling of finishing a book gives pride and confidence. I remember the first long story I read in English. I struggled at the beginning. Some sentences were hard, but I read a little every day. After a week, I finished it. I felt proud. I felt strong. That is why I always tell my students, it is okay to read slowly. Every page counts. Every day counts. Reading also builds language skills without pressure. You absorb vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structures naturally. I remember when I read a story about a boy who wanted to travel. The story used words I had never seen before. I did not look them up. I understood from the meaning. Later, when I spoke or wrote, I used the same words naturally. That is the magic of reading. You learn without memorizing. You grow without stress. That is why reading is the fastest way to improve English. One day I realized that reading had changed me completely. I was more patient, more confident, more creative, more calm. I could speak better, write better, and understand more. I could think in English. I could enjoy stories. I could live in another world for a while. And all this came from one simple habit: reading every day. That is why I always tell my students on Bookish English, you must read. It is the simplest, fastest, and most powerful way to learn English. Choose easy books. Choose fun stories. Read every day. Enjoy every page. The rest will come naturally. I also remind them that reading is not only for learning English, it is for life. Books teach lessons, create imagination, build character, and give peace. Reading is a friend, a teacher, and a guide. That is why reading is so important. That is why every learner, every student, every person should read. It is not hard. It is not boring. It is magic. And the magic starts when you open your first page. As I read more and shared stories on Bookish English, I noticed another thing. Reading teaches consistency. When you read every day, you create a routine. At first, it is difficult. Some days you may feel tired or busy. You may want to watch videos or play games instead. That is normal. But if you open a book for even 5 minutes, you practice consistency. Slowly, your brain gets used to focusing, your eyes get used to reading, and your mind starts thinking in English. One of my students told me, "Sam, I don't have time to read. I am busy with school and homework." I said, "That is okay. Read just a little every day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, even 1 page. It is enough. Consistency matters more than quantity." She tried it. After a month, she said, "I can read 10 pages every day." It is easy now. That is how small daily habits create big results. Another wonderful effect of reading is that it teaches you curiosity. When you finish one story, you want to know more. What happens next? How does the character feel? What is the world like? That curiosity drives you to read more books, more stories, more adventures. And every story you read teaches you new words, new phrases, new ideas. That is why I always say, reading is endless learning. There is no limit. You can always read one more book, discover one more story, meet one more character. That is the beauty of books. One day I read a story about a young girl who wanted to be an artist. She drew every day, sometimes badly, sometimes well. She never gave up. She learned from mistakes, and in the end, she became very good. That story reminded me of reading. At first, reading in English may feel hard. You may not understand everything. You may forget words. You may read slowly. But if you continue every day, you will improve naturally. You will become strong. You will succeed. That is the lesson. Reading also helps you feel calm and peaceful. When you open a book, the world around you disappears. You are in the story. You hear the characters. You see the places. You feel the emotions. And for a while, your worries are gone. One evening, I was stressed from work and teaching. I opened a small fairy tale book. I read a few pages. I smiled. I laughed. I forgot my stress. That is why I always tell my students, books are like friends. They make you feel happy and calm. You can always find comfort in stories. I also realized that reading helps your listening and speaking indirectly. At first, it may seem that reading only improves your vocabulary and writing. But when you have more words in your mind, your brain recognizes them when you hear them. You understand better. You can speak better. That is why even if your goal is speaking, reading is essential. One of my students struggled with speaking English. He could listen, but speaking was difficult. I asked him to read easy stories every day. After a few months, he said, "Sam, I can speak now." Words come naturally. That is the magic of reading. It builds a foundation for everything. Another thing I noticed is that reading helps memory in a special way. When you remember characters, events, and details from stories, your brain practices remembering naturally. You do not study lists or tests. You remember without pressure, and that memory stays longer. I remember reading a story about a castle. I learned many words, descriptions, and details. Later, when I wrote or spoke, I used the same words without thinking. That is how reading creates long-term memory. I also learned that reading teaches self-discipline. You must sit and focus. You must continue even if it is hard. That practice helps in school, in work, and in life. One of my students said, "I cannot focus. I get distracted." I suggested she read a short story every day. She did. Slowly, she could focus for longer. Her grades improved. Her confidence improved. Reading trained her mind. I also realized that reading creates empathy for others. You read stories about people who are different from you. You understand their feelings, their struggles, and their happiness. That helps you understand real people better. You become kind and patient. You listen more. You care more. That is a life skill. One of my students read a story about a poor boy who worked hard every day. She said, "Sam, I feel different. I want to help others." That is the power of reading. Another amazing effect of reading is imagination. Stories allow you to see new worlds. You can picture places, hear sounds, and feel emotions. Your mind creates pictures for you. That is something that videos or games cannot fully give. Your brain is active. Your creativity grows. That is why reading is not just learning English. It is learning to think, imagine, and create. I also learned that reading gives freedom. You do not need a teacher. You do not need a classroom. You do not need a schedule. You only need a book. You choose the story. You choose the pace. You choose the time. That freedom makes reading enjoyable. One of my students told me, "Sam, I read in the park, on the bus, and before sleep." I love it. That is the magic. Books are always available. You can carry them anywhere. You can enter a story anytime. That makes learning flexible and fun. Finally, I realized that reading gives pride and accomplishment. When you finish a story, you feel proud. You read the words, you understood the ideas, you reached the end. That feeling motivates you to read more. One of my students finished a short novel. She said, "Sam, I never thought I could do it." I feel proud. That pride is powerful. It encourages learning. It creates confidence. It makes you happy. That is why I tell every student, read a little every day. Choose easy books. Choose fun stories. Enjoy every page. Learn naturally. And always feel proud of yourself. Reading is simple. Reading is fun. Reading is powerful. Reading changes your life. That is why every learner, every student, and every person must read.